I'd ask you this morning to think of a book in the Bible that really impresses you and at the same time kind of intimidates you, scares you a little bit. A book of the Bible that really impresses you and at the same time intimidates you. This morning we come to one of those books for me in my life. Because in my opinion, of all the 66 books of the Bible, the wisdom books of the Old Testament hold the greatest concentration of philosophy and practical understanding about how to live a life of sanity, passion, and purpose. In our world, there can be influencers who try to teach you how to live a life of passion. But sometimes it's lacking sanity. You dig a little deeper and you can just see the cliff that it's taking you to and it's going to drop you. There are those who would influence you towards sanity. But the emotions that it draws from to push you to that version of sanity sometimes are a little frightening. Don't feel necessarily like they're coming from God. And there are those who are great at purpose, but ignore the realities of a fragmented soul and psyche that can derail the best intentions of living the way we think we should. The wisdom books of the Old Testament, though, man, are they great at just kind of bringing all of that together. Within the books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes, we find answers to intimidating questions that we're not really getting answers to anywhere else. Questions like, what is the purpose of life? How do I navigate the kind of suffering that really resists logical explanations? What's the nature of love? How do I navigate what it means to live an emotionally healthy life with God? What does it look like to cultivate a healthy soul? Wise people seek meaningful answers to these kinds of questions. And these 5 books speak with such transparency and insight that we could spend the rest of our lives just kind of exploring what they teach us. At the same time, one of the 5 wisdom books holds a special position. And you can only imagine which of the 5 holds a special position. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. You can only imagine which one holds a special position. And frankly, as a preacher, this book intimidates me more than the book of Revelation. It's written more than 900 years before the birth of Jesus, and yet was not formally accepted into the Jewish canon until the end of the 1st century AD, CE, however you want to call that, after Christ. Even though one prominent Jewish leader said that although all of the books of the Jewish Bible are holy, this book is the holy of holies. It was more than 300 years later before the Christian church formally accepted this book into our canon. And some of the reasons are obvious. In this book, the name of God is never mentioned. It uses words that are found nowhere else in the Old Testament. And not just a couple, like 47 words are found in this book, found nowhere else in the Old Testament. The content is uncomfortably graphic and sexual for this poor conservative farm boy. A young woman is in love with a young man, and the most common theme expressed in a variety of ways is the joy and the excitement these 2 lovers find in each other's presence. Aren't you glad you brought your kids to church today? Yes, I would love to. I'm begging you. You can read this book purely as instruction for a healthy romantic relationship, and you would gain tons of wisdom. At the same time, it is difficult to overlook the fact that for centuries, this book has been part of the Jewish celebration of Passover. There is this striking connection between this book and what it means to be loved and protected and saved by the living God. Now, perhaps by now you figured out that I'm talking about the Song of Songs of Solomon. The Song of Songs of Solomon. S-O-S-O-S. Oh, please help me. It's an indirect way of saying this is the best song that has ever been sung. Now, in a culture that has largely reduced sex to recreation rather than intimacy, I think it's important to hear that the Bible and God give enormous dignity to the physical body. That it is through our physical body that God has given us a capacity to experience intimate connection in beauty and holiness. God created us with physical bodies, and our bodies are the vehicle through which we love one another and love God. So our relationship with God is not all intellectual, nor is it all emotion. We are to love God with our entire being. And by soaking ourselves in this love poetry, we are intended to grow confident that God really does desire us. That God really does pursue us and romance our soul. That God really does seek a deep connection with us. And in soaking ourselves in this love poetry, we are also intended to recognize our throbbing passion for the living God. A love that must find expression. It's just driven to it. A love that, when thwarted from expression, strives with all its might for the next encounter with the one our soul loves. This is how the Jewish community in the early church understood the Song of Solomon. Now, how many of you have ever heard a sermon from the book of the Song of Solomon? I am delighted and surprised that there are almost half a dozen of you in the crowd. I grew up, never heard a single one. And I might have done it once or twice here, but not much. And yet, in the early church, just a little side note because I'm a bit of a history fiend sometimes, Origen, in the 2nd century early church, considered the foremost scholar in the Christian church in the 2nd century, wrote a 12-volume commentary on the book of Song of Solomon. And Bernard of Clairvaux in the Middle Ages, around 1100s, preached over 80 sermons, and barely got through chapter 2 on Song of Solomon. So there was a time when the Song of Solomon was central, not just to the Jewish community, but the Christian community. It was kind of the prayer book that would just kind of lead God's people in relationship to him. So with that in mind, I'll mention that the general movements of Solomon's Song of Songs comes in 3 parts. The first part is an anticipation phase that describes the love of an engaged couple who cannot wait to get married. Just that crazy in love, over the top, man, every moment with you is like ecstatic. Then there is a poetic description of the wedding itself. And then a description of their relationship after the wedding. And it begins with very little introduction. You know, this is Solomon's song. And then it's like, then the woman, in some translations called the bride, understood by God's people who are deeply in love with the living God, begins with this. This is Scripture. It took a while, but this is Scripture. And this is awkward. May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. For your love is sweeter than wine. Your oils have a pleasing fragrance. Your name is like purified oil. Therefore, the young women love you. Yeah, I'm blushing. She loves the man. In some translations called the groom. Understood to be the living God, who is the object of our intense desire and who loves you and loves me with an almost frightening intensity. To the bride, his name is like purified oil. His name feels great on her lips. In other words, she is drawn to his character, and the thought of him makes her happy. Just the thought of him makes her happy. There are some names, when we say them on our lips, it evokes from us an immediate and physical, emotional reaction. What are some of those names that you say and it just elicits from you maybe a not so positive emotional response? It's true. There are certain people within our culture that we just simply mention their name and it sparks a mental and emotional and physical response. Maybe there's some other names. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe some other leader. Maybe a boss or an influencer or an athlete. If I were to happen to live or have ties to Calgary, and I heard the name Connor McDavid, I would have a very different response than if I were an ardent Edmonton Oilers fan. Same name is received so much differently on our lips. In verses 13 and 14, he is like expensive and rare fragrances. His presence is intoxicating to her and precious. Reading on, she feels safe and protected with him and well provided for. There is a security and just a confidence in his love. So imagine the Jewish community reading this during their Passover celebrations as a reminder how God's love protects and provides, and how every remembrance of his character just tastes good on our lips. The bride feels unworthy of his attention and describes herself with something almost like embarrassment. Do not stare at me because I'm dark, for the sun has tanned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the caretaker of the vineyards, but I have not taken care of my own vineyard. In other words, her skin is dark from hard work, being in the sun, caring for others, and having no time to care for herself. But the groom does not share her low opinion of herself, and he responds by singing, "How beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves." This is poetry, right? Not to be taken literally. She's not got birds in her head. Right? She's not a feather brain. And we can do the word studies, but somehow as you're doing word studies in poetry, it seems to suck the life out of it. It's interesting. It resists sometimes just reducing it to saying, well, this represents this and this represents this. I think we're meant to take it as a whole, as poetry, as beauty, as aesthetic, describing the love God has for us. And again, the woman puts herself down in chapter 2. I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. It's kind of lost to our culture today, but it's a way of saying, I'm just a common flower amongst a whole field of flowers. There's nothing special about me. And again, the groom says that he sees her differently. Like a lily among the thorns, so is my darling among the young women. I mean, if you want to call yourself a flower, fine. But as a flower, you stand out from all the other women the way a flower stands out from thorny weeds. Gentlemen, there's your Valentine's card. You are so much better than a thistle. The entire book is written in this conversational style, and it is the only book in the Bible written like this. There's no explanation, no interpretation of their conversation, and yet both the Jewish and the early church community have held that this is wisdom to guide our practical understanding of what it means to love and be loved by the living God. That we've been created physically, emotionally, mentally to be in love with the living God. Song of Solomon reminds us for what we have been created. What God intends for us is the beautiful delight and fulfillment that is celebrated in the Song of Solomon. I do want us to notice a phrase in chapter 2, verse 16 that's repeated again in chapter 6, verse 3, and again in chapter 7, verse 10, in all the phases of the relationship. My beloved is mine, and I am his. My beloved is mine, and I am his. In healthy relationships, that is a beautiful statement of possession. We belong to each other. A statement that's still used in some wedding vows today. When you say that in a marriage, you are saying, regardless of what happens in the future, loss of job, loss of your good looks, loss of health, it does not matter. So long as I am alive, I am yours and you are mine. 7 times in the Old Testament, God says it to his people in this way. I will be your God and you will be my people. 7 times he says that. It's the foundation of a healthy and secure relationship. And oh, how we need this picture of God's love. For we have so much trouble holding on to the idea of what intimacy and faithfulness looks like in the love that lasts. Even with the best of intentions, even though we are created to love, we still get mixed up, distracted, trying to define, okay, what exactly is love? Or we become depressed by our failures to love, or by the failures of others to love, and resentful of their failures. I mean, when you've been in love for a while, there is a certain inevitability that the relationship morphs a little bit. You fall into routine, and it becomes so easy to focus on the day-to-day problems and the failures to love that inevitably show up. Some couples just kind of gather around those failures, and it eats away at the relationship. And how heartbreaking it is to see those in the second stage of life, their marriage relationship crumbling. And often it's just all we can come to see are the faults. So many people in the world feel like it is their divine calling to see and point out the faults of others. It's kind of the foundation of so much of our social media. And if you're close to someone, you can see their faults all day long, if that's what you're looking for. And how sad it is when that becomes all that we're looking for. And it happens. For sin infects all human relationships with its disintegrating power. How instructive for us that the Jewish people connected this book to Passover. Passover commemorated the pivotal act of God's redemptive salvation love in redeeming his people from slavery. It was the great act in which they experienced the living God as loving Savior and themselves as beloved and redeemed. And the annual celebration of the Passover was to keep that memory fresh. And yet, anything repeated often enough, long enough, can lose its freshness, can lose its vitality, can lose its meaning. The actions are there, but the emotions of love may not. And to protect against this danger, the Song of Solomon was read as the concluding act of the Passover feast. No other reading in the mind of the Jewish community, no other reading communicated the intimacy and the joy of being made whole and being in good relationship to another person more convincingly than this song. When we first encounter God's love through Jesus Christ, His love is exhilarating, sometimes overwhelming to us. To know and to feel loved by God. To be saved and brought to life by the work of Jesus upon the cross and the empty tomb. It's like the love sung by Solomon. And yet over time, even God's love can become such a familiar part of our landscape that our thoughts of God and His love and our language about Him and our feelings about our relationship with Him can become stagnant and stale. In the language of Revelation chapter 2, verse 4, we lose our first love. It's a very real danger. It is possible for even worship, prayer, the reading of the Bible to become impersonal, lifeless. Jesus commands us to practice a meal that remembers His love and the actions of His love in saving us. And we use the word communion to describe that meal and how we come to God and how God comes to us. Now, next week we're going to do this communion meal, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist in some traditions. And I invite you to read the Song of Solomon throughout the week and think about which phrases, which verses resonate as you think about how God expresses His love over you. And just as importantly, how you express your love for Him in the daily rhythms of your life. For notice how earthy the Song of Solomon is, how much of these statements are rooted in the daily activities of this woman and this man who love one another. This God who loves His people and His people who love their God. And I invite you to explore fresh ways of physically expressing your love for God. Those of you who know me well know that I am not an expressive kind of guy. I generally listen to worship songs in kind of a physically passive way. And great emotional experiences, I'll kind of look exactly like I'm looking right now. That was hilarious. My heart is absolutely broken. Historically, that's just kind of been part of my makeup, and that comes from a variety of sources. I have explored over the years using my hands as I sing songs of God's love for me and songs of my love for God. It helps. It does something. I become self-conscious and more conscious of the fact that, yes, this is how I feel. Somehow when I'm doing that, just a small physical trigger that brings not just to my mind what I'm singing, but to my heart, and then makes it more expressive. Might be different for you. I'm thinking this week that I might explore trying to vocalize my love for God a lot more. I don't sing in the shower. I don't naturally sing while I drive. Some of you do. I have huge respect for that. I'm going to give it a try to sing out loud. Maybe even as I'm, saying certain Bible verses while I drive, I might change the tone of my voice and become more expressive. It's just these small physical things that somehow trigger something within us. We see it in the Song of Solomon. These small physical things that are just part of a whole being love. Some of us don't come from this kind of a background where, the outrageous love that you have for your spouse is never really expressed. That the last time you heard your spouse say, I am head over heels in love with you. I find so much joy in our relationship, and I cannot imagine a single day without you. Some of us have never heard that from our partner and long for it. Some of us feel enormously awkward at saying that out loud to even the person who is closest to us in this world. Well, I invite you this week to attempt that with God, who loves you and understands you even better than the person you're married to. And I'm not creative with my hands. Perhaps you are, and you would explore a physical expression of your love for God through the creative arts in some way. Dance, painting. And you're just thinking of God's love while you're painting or decorating or making something beautiful. Or perhaps you'd write your own love poem to God. The best you can as you're doing these things and exploring this in the laboratory of your life this week, the best you can, hold back from being self-critical of what you're doing. I put my hands up while I was saying, oh man, I look so awkward. Maybe I should close my fingers or maybe I should wave and am I in tune to the music? We become so self-critical as we're doing some of these things. Or we're painting as an expression of our love to God and we're like, man, I'm not on the lines. This is out of perspective. This could be so much better. The best you can you hold back from being self-critical as you're expressing your love to God in whatever it is you're doing? Just notice, the best you can, just notice how it brings God's presence closer or further away, and how physical expression affects your emotions and your thoughts relative to your love for God. So that's the invitation this week, to give that a try.